Hey guys, welcome to the Hacked Existence tutorial on building a Pwnagotchi. So the Pwnagotchi is a modern day take on the Tamagatchi of the 90s, but with a cybersecurity twist. So if you look at Tamagatchi here, he's doing the I'm not very impressed with you face because he's taken two steaming poops on the floor and expects me to clean them up, but when I try to clean them up, he won't let me because he's mad at me right now because I've been neglecting him. So it's an emotional thing, and you kind of have to balance out his emotions by taking care of him and giving him the attention he needs. With the Pwnagotchi, it derives its happiness from its ability to sniff WPA and WPA2 handshakes. So under the hood, it uses BetterCap to do a site survey to figure out all of the wireless networks and clients connected to those networks that are in range. Then it uses Advantage Actor Critic, or A2C, which is an artificial intelligence methodology to figure out which clients to attack in which order. So it has multiple different attacks, but the one I noticed the most is that it will actually de-auth a client and then sniff the handshake when that client automatically reconnects. So to be clear, the Pwnagotchi doesn't actually crack the Wi-Fi password. What it does is it makes a PCAP that it saves on its micro SD card of the handshake, which you can then move to a far superior cracking rig and run it through something like hashcat, where you can do a dictionary or a brute force attack to try to figure out the password to the Wi-Fi. So the Pwnagotchi is also a social device, so when you put two of them together, they will actually start talking to each other, and they'll split up the Wi-Fi channels among themselves in a divide and conquer strategy to pwn twice as many networks in the same amount of time. So a pwned network is basically a network that you've captured the handshake for. And as you can see, mine has pwned 2 in the last session and 25 total. Basically the battery is dead, the screen stays burned in, but you can see my battery lasted about 5.5 hours of only managed to pwn 2 networks, but it's because it had already seen most of the networks that were in range and had already pwned them previously. You can also enable grid and reporting functionality, where your Pwnagotchi will send its stats back out to the internet so that you can be ranked in a scoreboard of pwning stats for Pwnagotchis from around the world. So I think my favorite part of this project is just how modular everything is. This project can be as deep or as shallow as you want. It's got everything from beginner to advanced. You can run the whole thing on a $10 Raspberry Pi Zero and do it headless. For 20 bucks, I added this screen, but there's a whole bunch of options. You can get a color screen, all kinds of different screens you can add. For 40 bucks, I added this giant battery. You can get a smaller battery. You can run it off an external battery. There's so many options. When you go and look at the 3D printed cases, there's about 7 different form factors of 3D printed cases because everything is so modular. You can even jump into it and tweak out all the artificial intelligence algorithms and weights and try and make your Pwnagotchi a little smarter. So overall, really cool project, something for everybody at every level. Let's jump in. Alright, so before we jump into putting this thing together, let's quickly take a look at the bill of materials. And what you guys need to understand is that every single hardware component in here is interchangeable. What I'm going to show you guys is the hardware that I've chosen to do my build out of. So I'm going to build mine on top of the Raspberry Pi Zero W. And the first optional upgrade is these 3 pads here. You can solder a socket to plug an external antenna into to give yourself a little more gain. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to rely on this triangle that's etched into the board, which is actually the antenna for the onboard wireless chipset. So on top of that, we're going to add the 2.13 inch e-paper hat from Waveshare. And this is the version 2. You can tell by the red sticker here. And basically, it's going to connect to the Pi over the GPIO pins. So on the Pi, you're going to need to either get a 0W with the GPIO pins already on it, or you need to get some header pins and solder them on yourself. The next optional upgrade is a real-time clock. So you don't actually need to do this one. I actually ran it for about a week without one and then added the clock to see what the difference was. And there's not a lot of difference. It's basically that the timestamps are more accurate. It's a fun little board to add on to the project, so I went ahead and did it. And this is the first real-time clock that I bought. It was $1. And it's just way too big. So I ended up buying this one from Adafruit. It was about $5. And it's a little bit larger than will fit in here nicely. So what I'm going to end up doing is removing this plug here by just snipping these leads and taking the plug off. I'm also using a 16 gig micro SD. You need an 8 gig minimum. The 16 gig seems to function pretty well. I'm going to power the thing with a Pi Sugar 1200 milliamp hour battery. So this battery just sticks on a magnet on the back of this driver board. It's got this button on the side that turns it on with some little blue LED level indicators, 2 clicks to turn it off. And it just contacts the Pi to turn itself on. So there's nothing to solder on or plug in. And finally, we'll wrap the whole thing up by putting it in a nice little 3D printed enclosure. So now we'll start by soldering on these header pins. Alright, so now we've got the header pins all soldered onto our Raspberry Pi. So what I'm going to do next is take the e-paper display and plug it in to the GPIO pins. Get this all popped on here. And we can see this plug on the bottom of the display sets it up nicely so it's nice and flat. And there's a big gap here on the GPIO pins. So one of the optional mods that I'm not going to do, if I wasn't doing a real-time clock, I would do it, but I need that space to put the real-time clock in there, is called the Pwnagotchi, where people actually shave down these GPIO pins and remove this plug to get these two things to sit closer to each other, make it a whole lot slimmer. So that's a pretty cool mod. If you're not doing the real-time clock, I suggest you check that one out. But we are going to do a real-time clock, and the problem here is we can't really fit it in here without it protruding. So what we're going to do is start by setting up our real-time clock, and then we'll come back to how to install it. Basically, we're going to need to put 4 wires on here. We're not going to use the SQW, that's a square wave. We don't need to give a square wave signal to the Pi for it to tell time. We just need these first 4 pins: ground, VCC, SDA, and SCL. So I'm going to start by putting 4 wires on those slots. Alright, so now we have the 4 wires soldered on to our real-time clock, and these are just wire leads that we're going to solder onto the GPIO pins in a little bit. But first, the next thing we're going to do is put our battery into our real-time clock, and then we're going to use some electrical tape and wrap this whole thing in electrical tape so that when we sandwich it between the 2 boards, nothing contacts and shorts anything out. Alright, so now this is nice and covered in electrical tape, and before you do that, you're going to want to make sure you know which color wires go to which pins. So now, in order to make this fit in the sandwich between here, we're going to have to remove this white plug, which we don't use since we use the GPIO pin to connect these two together. So let's take this E-hat off. Alright, now I'm basically just going to use a pair of snips to snip all of these plugs coming out of the back of this plug and cut off the 2 pieces where it's soldered to the board here and just remove this plug altogether. Alright, now I'll use my snips to just clean up any kind of remnants that are on here, kind of make these as flat as I can get them. Alright, and that should be pretty good. Now we've got that plug removed, so what I'm going to do is test fit this out. So I want it to sit about right there, and we'll put the e-paper hat back on. It fits pretty well right about there. So the next thing I'm going to do is take this e-hat off now that I know where I want my real-time clock to sit. And basically these 4 wires need to go to the GPIO pins. So what I'm going to do is put my real-time clock about where it needs to be, and I'm going to feed the wires one at a time through this hole so that we can solder them on to the bottom of the board. Alright, so now we've got our wires coming out and doing a nice little run. You can see it's pretty flat there, going right through this hole, coming out on the bottom side. So let's jump over to the computer and look up the GPIO pins to figure out where these wires need to go. Alright, so I've laid out a little table of the wire colors and the pins they're hooked up to, and looking at the GPIO of the Raspberry Pi, we're going to power our RTC with 3.3 volts. You're going to want to check the voltage on yours. Some of them require 5 volts, but we'll bring VCC to 3.3 volts here. SDA will go to this pin, SCL will go to pin 5, and we'll bring the ground to pin 6. So that'll make our pin out 6, 1, 3, 5. Alright, so now we're going to do black, which is the ground, to pin 6, which is right here, and we're going to do red, green, and white to pins 1, 3, and 5. So let's go ahead and solder those on. Alright, so now we can see that all 4 of our RTC wires have soldered on to the back of the GPIO pins, and they're pretty flat. If you look at them, you can't see them protruding at all, and that's going to help with that battery driver pack. If we only nail it down in these 3 corners, it's still going to sit pretty flat, which is exactly what we want. So now we've got our RTC all set up. Let's go ahead and get our microSD configured. Alright, so now we'll navigate to the Pwnagotchi website, which is pwnagotchi.ai, and we'll go to the installation page. And we'll scroll down to the flashing an image section, click on download the latest Pwnagotchi release, which will take us to GitHub, and I'm going to pull down this zip file, which you can see I've already pulled down. So now I'll use Apple Pi Baker to write that to our micro SD. I'm going to select the IMG file here. Alright, so now that we've written the image to the micro SD card, there's one more thing we need to do before we boot this thing up. If we go back to the Pwnagotchi website and go to the configuration page, I'm going to copy this text here. We'll pull up a terminal and I'm going to CD into the volume that got put on the micro SD. And so here on the root of the micro SD, I'm going to make a new text file called config.yml and we'll paste that config. Now right here where the name is, you can change that to whatever you want. I've already got one called Pwnagotchi, so I'm going to call this one Steve. I'm not going to have anything in my whitelist here. And I'm going to set the grid plugin and report to false. You can read about what those do. If you want to leave them enabled, feel free. And I'm going to leave the display settings because I am running the WaveShare version 2 and it is black. So now I will write this file. And we can see here it created config.yml. So now we're ready to do our first boot. I'm going to go ahead and eject this disk. I will pop the micro SD out of the computer, plug it into the Pwnagotchi, plug the screen on, and basically what I'm going to do next is plug a USB cable in to the data port and plug that into my MacBook. Now the initial boot's going to take about 5 minutes. If you interrupt that process, you're probably going to have to reformat your micro SD. So let it boot up and just wait for the screen to start becoming animated. Alright, so now we can see that Steve has finished all of his initialization. He's got all zeroed out stats. He's running in manual mode because we were plugged into the data port. So basically manual mode is when the Pwnagotchi services are all turned down so that you can configure how those services are going to behave. Automatic mode is when Steve will turn on and begin deauthenticating clients and sniffing handshakes, and you can get into automatic mode by applying power to the power port or from a battery. But first we'll configure how that automatic mode is going to work using the computer and the data port. So let's jump over to the computer and get Steve all set up. Alright, so the data port on the Pwnagotchi masquerades to the host as an Ethernet interface. And what this means is if we look at our network preferences here, we can see that there is a new network interface, and this is coming off the Pi. So what I'm going to do is turn off my Wi-Fi so there's no conflicts, and you manually need to configure an address of 10.0.0.1 with a gateway of 10.0.0.1. Those settings are right here on the configuration page of the site. And once you've done that, you should be able to pull up a terminal and ssh-l pi 10.0.0.2. Yes, Raspberry is the default password. And now we can see we've SSH'd into our Pwnagotchi. So the first thing we're going to do is go to etc Pwnagotchi, and in here we'll vim config.yaml, and we can see that's the config file that we created in the root of the SD originally. So now what I want to do is fill this up with all the default values so that we can just go in and tweak them instead of having to build that file out by scratch. And the way that we do that is going to Chrome and going to 10.0.0.2:8080. And here we can see the interface of our Pwnagotchi. So what I'm going to do is go over here to this plugins button, and I'm going to enable the WebCFG plugin, and then I'll click on WebCFG. After I refresh this page, you can see it's not linked now, but once I refresh the page, it becomes a hyperlink. And so now these are all the options that the config will accept with a bunch of default values. So what I'm going to do is hit save to write all of those values into that config.yaml. Now it says it's been upgraded. So if we switch back to terminal and look at that same file again, we can see that now all of our settings are in here and we can modify them accordingly. But rather than modifying them through here, I'm going to modify them through the web interface, and there's a few settings that we need to look at. Alright, so definitely feel free to dig through all these config items either in the GUI here or from the terminal. The one that I'm going to change is temp. I'm going to turn memtemp enabled to true. I'm going to change Celsius to Fahrenheit, and I'll leave it at horizontal. So I'm going to hit save. And basically this error is because when I pushed the settings last time, it rebooted. So I'm looking at a page that's no longer being served. So basically I just need to refresh this page again, which is no longer found. So I'll have to go back in all the way from the home page to plugins, enable WebCFG, refresh, go to WebCFG. Now I'll have to make my changes to temp, true, horizontal, Fahrenheit, and save. Now we can see the config was updated. We'll wait for the Pwnagotchi to reboot here. And now once it's rebooted, if we go back into the main page of the web server again on port 8080, we'll see that we've added memory, CPU, and temperature. Alright, so in addition to SSH and this Pwnagotchi interface on 8080, we can also talk to the Pwnagotchi on port 80, which is the better cap interface. So this is the scanner that is identifying hosts to be processed by the Pwnagotchi. So now that we've taken a look at the ways to interface with it from a computer, let's jump back over to the Pwnagotchi itself and get it into auto mode, so it's going to start consuming handshakes. Alright, so now I'm going to remove the power from the data port, and what you'll see is the screen stays on because this works just like an Etch-a-Sketch. The screen will stay burned in with whatever's on it, even if you remove power until you update it again. So next I'm going to attach the battery. We're going to go through these 3 points here. I'll stick a spacer between and then do the bolt and nut. But to make that a little easier to do, I'm going to take the screen off first. Alright, now we have our complete battery powered Pwnagotchi stack. We can turn it on with this power button here. You can see the battery indicator lights up, and there's the power LED on the Pi board. You can see that green light in there. It takes about a minute to boot, and then it'll drop into automatic mode and start deauthing clients and sniffing handshakes. So now that we're all up and running, let's jump back over to the computer and take a look at 3D printed cases. Alright, so back on the Pwnagotchi website, on the installation page, there's this case section about halfway down, and if you look at these 10 Pwnagotchi cases, which you'll see is that it's actually up to 14 now, by this guy, oh hi there. This is an awesome little set of all of these different configurations that are already drawn up and ready to print on a printer. So I'm going to print out the wave share with the Pi Sugar 1200 and the battery carabiner loop. Alright, so this is a time lapse from Octoprint of the print being printed out on a Creality CR10 using a 0.4mm nozzle with a 0.04 layer height. This print took about 11 hours to complete. Alright, so this is what came off of the printer. It's got a nice little carabiner clip here. Had to clean it up a little bit. It's got a little lid that we can press on there and a little button to go in the power slot. But what I'm going to do before I put this thing in here is two things. First, I'm going to start by ripping off this red plastic tab. And now what I'm going to do is use my snips, and I'm going to remove this because if you look, this will go in here, but the wires from the Pi Sugar kind of conflict with it a little bit. So I'm going to just cut out these two pieces and then it'll fit in perfectly. Alright, now that I've taken that separator most of the way out, I'm going to put this button in that printed out. Alright, now that that power button's in there, I'm going to go ahead and put this Pwnagotchi in. And one thing you do need to remember is to remove the micro SD card. We'll put it back in through the little slot. Alright, now that our Pwnagotchi's in there pretty nicely, we will put the bottom plate on. Throw a carabiner on here. Now if we come back and hit the power button, you can see the power LEDs shining through there. And if we let this boot all the way up, we'll boot into auto mode and we'll start pwning networks. If you haven't done the RTC mod, you are good to go. Everything is done. Since I did the RTC mod, what I'm going to do is plug the data port back into my MacBook, get the network all set up, SSH into it, and get that RTC configured. Alright, so I've written out some notes on what we need to do. The first thing we need to do is enable the I2C interface, and we do that by running sudo raspi-config, option 5, interfacing options, again option 5, I2C. We're going to say yes, we want to enable it, hit OK. And we'll finish, and we'll do sudo reboot. Okay, so now I've rebooted, and I'm SSH back into Steve, and I'm going to run sudo I2C detect -y1, and address 68 shows up as 68, which is what we're hoping for. So now we can go edit /boot/config.txt and turn on this parameter. So we'll do sudo vim /boot/config.txt. And we can see dt param I2C _ arm equals on is not commented out. So next we'll add this dt overlay for the real-time clock. I'm just going to copy that, go all the way to the bottom of the file here. And I'll just paste it right there. We'll write and quit and do a sudo reboot. Okay, now that we've rebooted, we'll run a sudo I2C detect -y1. And now we can see that address 68 has turned to UU, which is what we were hoping for. So now we can remove the fake HW clock using sudo apt-get -y remove fake -HW clock. Alright, now we need to remove fake HW clock from rc.d, so go ahead and run that command. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and vim this file and comment out these 3 lines. And that's those 3 lines here. And then we'll make sure that these 2 lines are commented out as well. We'll write and quit and do a sudo reboot. Alright, so at this point, if we ask the hardware clock what time it is, it's not going to know because it hasn't been initialized yet. No one's told it what time to start counting from. So the first thing we're going to do is set the time locally on the Pi, and I'm going to set it to 1 second before Christmas. And then what we'll do is use the hardware clock command to copy from the system to the hardware clock. -D is for debug, no ADJ file. Basically tells the clock not to compensate for being a clock, and we'll set the time zone to UTC. There we go. Alright, now if we look at the time that's stored in the hardware clock, we can see it tells us it's Christmas, and if we look at the system time, it also tells us it's Christmas. So now we'll reboot one more time. Alright, so in addition to rebooting, I also did a full power cycle, and now we can check the system time as well as the hardware clock. And we can see that the timestamp has survived a power cycle, so everything is good to go with the hardware clock. Alright, so hopefully at this point you guys have a fully functioning Pwnagotchi, so we can disconnect him, kick the battery on, and get out there and start pwning all the Wi-Fi. So I really enjoyed this project. I hope you guys did too. As always, stay tuned, and thanks for watching.